Welcome to Not So Quiet on the Western Front, the podcast where we lift the lid, bust the myths, and explore the incredible history of the First World War. I'm Dan Hill, a military historian and battlefield guide specialising in the history of the war on the Western Front.
And I'm Dr. Spencer Jones, author and senior lecturer in war studies at the University of Wolverhampton. In this episode, we'll examine one of the enduring controversies of the First World War. Why did the Allies keep attacking the Western Front when all the advantages seemed to lie with the defender? What informed these decisions? Were there other options? And how did these choices play out on the battlefield? Hi Dan, always a pleasure to be joining you on the podcast. And today's topic is one that I think if we were given a certain monetary value for every time we've been asked this question, why did the Allies keep attacking, even when it seemed they were just building an even bigger casualty list, then we might be relatively wealthy men. It's certainly a question I get asked a lot by my undergraduate students, and I know it's a question that you get asked on the battlefield often as well.
Yeah, hi Spence, it absolutely is. And I think part of the reason behind that question coming up so often is exactly what you've just mentioned there. It's enormously high casualty lists. And I think as we discussed previously in earlier episodes, in a sense, I think there needs to be an understanding of why this happens. How do we justify those losses, particularly in the years, in just the early years post-war? Because, of course, it's not historians and interested observers asking these questions 110 years later that we really need to justify that answer to. It's to mothers and wives and children and parents. You know, that's a much bigger, much harder question to ask and answer in the 1920s. And I think the enduring legacy really of the First World War, as far as that goes, really starts at that point. So, you know, that was a question. It's not one that we've only started asking 100 years later. It's one that's been asked since the 11th of November, 1918. And truthfully, I'm not sure we've still got an absolutely crystal clear answer to this. But it's very interesting to kind of pose that question and throw around a few of the options.
It really is. And you've made a great point that this question is getting asked the moment the war ends. In fact, it's even being asked whilst the war is being fought. Why do British, French, and then later, of course, the American armies keep throwing themselves at this fortress, really, of the Western Front, suffering enormous casualties for what looked like, on the map, very, very limited gains. A few miles for tens of thousands of lives does not seem a very good exchange rate, especially to politicians in Britain and also in France. And even, as you say, at the time, there is murmuring and there is controversy about, is this the best way to conduct the war? Is the military really approaching this in a sensible, measured way? And one of the leading figures who actually criticizes this approach, and he has enormous influence in Britain in the 1920s and especially the 1930s, is former Prime Minister David Lloyd George. He's actually been the wartime Prime Minister between 1916 and 1918. He serves until 1922, and then he's brought down in a huge political scandal. But in the 1930s, he publishes his memoirs, which are absolutely enormous bestsellers in Britain and the British Empire. And his memoirs, long volume, largely written by himself, he's a good writer, but really what he sets out to argue is there was another way we could have waged this war. There was a better way. We didn't have to throw the cream of the British Empire's manpower against the machine guns and barbed wire of the Western Front. We could have fought it elsewhere. We could have fought it in the Alps against the Austrians. We could have gone to the Balkans and fought the Germans there. We could have put all our resources into fighting the Ottoman Empire. Now, Lloyd George is not by any means a neutral observer of this war. He has all kinds of clashes with his high command, but he does capture this idea we're going to be discussing in a great quote when he writes. He's actually referring to 1917, and he complains that in 1917, the idea of the offensive gripped the generals like a disease of the mind. And for a politician who was not a military man, who came from a completely non-military background and was always a little bit ill at ease with the military, one thing that comes out very strongly from Lloyd George's experience is the military just seemed to be myopic about the idea of we need more resources to attack again and again and again and again. And yet the results they came back to give to the government always seemed so meagre. And Lloyd George's idea that there could have been a different way of fighting the war, a less costly way, perhaps an easier way to victory, was very, very powerful in the 1930s. And I can't overemphasize how widespread this idea became in both Britain and France in the 1930s. And it would actually lead to all kinds of rather negative outcomes, it must be said, in 1940. And it also, I think, this idea that there was a better way of fighting plays a big role in one of the myths we've discussed previously on this podcast series. And that's the idea that the British Army specifically and the Allied armies in general were lions led by donkeys. And I know you've got problems with that phrase.
I do indeed, as we've discussed at quite some length so far, but it never hurts to go back and smash an old myth if we can. Of course, a cursory look, I think, at any casualty list in the Great War is going to give a lot of people a lot of ammunition for making that argument, and perhaps even making it forcefully, and it's got to be said, in some instances, some real truth. Not everything goes well in the Great War. I'm sure we'll get into 1915 as we go through this episode. There are some pretty horrific decisions made in 1915, not just on the Western Front, it should be said. But the reality is, I think in order to go back and really understand the crux of this question and this broader issue, is to go back and look at what forms the Western Front in 1914. Why does fighting even take place in this part of the world? Because that underpins, I think, the much larger idea of why fighting goes on there, why there's an offensive spirit there, and why this question of lions led by donkeys even gets asked in the first place. And I think the main thing to remember here is that in 1914, in August of that year, the German army, of course, launches its huge Schlieffen Plan. The idea is to knock the French out of the war in a short period of time, just a matter of weeks, before turning its entire military might eastwards to do exactly the same to the Russians, who it's believed are going to be a bit slower to mobilize, and so that time gap, if you like, can be utilized. Now, we know in the course of events that isn't what happens, but what's quite often overlooked is the fact that when the Germany comes into Belgium, particularly in 1914, it captures 90% of that country. 9/10 of the entire country are captured. In fact, the reason Ypres, or Wipers, or Ypres, however you want to say it, is held onto so ferociously is one of the very few sizable towns still left in Belgian hands. Liège is gone, Brussels is gone, Antwerp is gone. All of these major towns and cities that are at the heart of the Belgian country have basically disappeared. Now there's a foreign power occupying 90% of Belgium. And you look slightly further south to the much larger and more formidable neighbour, the French, the same thing on a smaller scale has happened. But the important thing here is it's happened in a really crucial area. When the French have been attacked in 1914, they have lost Lille, they've lost the Douai Plains, or good chunks of it, and the Western Front has now winds its way through and basically chopped off the most powerful industrial area of France, which is now under German control. With those two absolutely crucial scene setters in place, we now need to say, well, why is there a spirit of offensiveness? Well, let's flip it on its head a little bit and talk about us, you and I, Spence, being from the UK. In Belgian terms, what's happened is the entire British Army has been pushed out of London, Manchester, Newcastle, Liverpool, any city you can think of, and the British Empire now consists of Cornwall. It's that much ground that's been taken. And if you talk about it from a French point of view, at least the northeast of the UK and much of that industrial powerhouse that's up in that direction has been gone as well. This is a fundamental and absolutely shattering shift that's happened to two allied nations of Britain. And I think maybe that's the word that we need to really focus on for this episode, Spence, and it's the fact that it's an allied fight.
Really, really important point. And let's not forget that Britain explicitly goes to war to defend Belgium. Britain has a treaty that stretches back to 1839 to defend Belgium from aggression. Interestingly enough, so does Prussia, which of course later becomes Germany. The Germans in 1914 dismissed this as a scrap of paper, an old treaty to be ignored. But it's easy to forget because we've lived through the Second World War, where, of course, neutrality was no guarantee of safety. We are living through wars now where neutrality is no guarantee of safety. That in 1914, for a major power like Germany to violate a neutral power like Belgium and assault it violently, and also, it has to be said, commit widespread atrocities as it did so, was absolutely shocking to British public opinion. And it mobilized British public opinion intensely against Germany. And it did so for two reasons. One, there was a clear violation of all international norms there was a clear violation of the rule of law internationally, which was intolerable, really, to the British political psyche. And secondly, there was a very, very real threat from Germany that if it can do this to Belgium, it can carry out this destruction of Belgium and its near total conquest of it, then it's a fairly short jump across the English Channel to land in Britain and do the same in Britain. And there was a real fear that Germany posed a significant threat, not just to Europe, but to Britain. Even though the Germans weren't fighting on British shores, it was widely recognised correctly in Britain that unless the Germans were stopped in continental Europe, the next stop would be the White Cliffs of Dover. And so there was a real need for the British to fight, even though their own land wasn't explicitly threatened in the way that the French and the Belgians were. And that linked the three powers, well, especially the French and the British, of course. The Belgian army, very small, largely defensive, doesn't really have the manpower to launch major offensives. So it's really the French and the British see the key to actually not merely triumphing in the war, but surviving the war. The very first thing that has to be done is the invader has to be driven out. And although the Schlieffen Plan fails, as we've discussed in our Mons episode, the Germans are stopped at the gates of Paris and are forced back. The tragedy for the Allies is they forced the German army back about 60 miles, so fairly biggish retreat, but then the Germans begin to dig in, and it's this that ultimately creates the Western Front. And what effectively the Germans have done is fortify the ground in front of all their conquests. And you made a great point, Dan. These are very economically valuable areas of France. Extremely economically valuable. Belgium, effectively all of its economy is gone. It's just clinging on to this edge of Western Belgium that's still in Allied hands. Belgium's completely dependent, really, on British and French support. And France has lost this huge chunk of territory, as well as close to 1 million soldiers killed, wounded, and missing, defending the homeland in 1914. And the appearance of the Western Front that serves as a barrier, as a fortification that's blocking the liberation of these areas means it's absolutely inevitable that the Allies, as soon as they're able, are going to try and attack this, breach it, and push the Germans back. And it means it's not just a purely military issue. Almost as soon as the Western Front forms, this is both a political issue, a military issue, an economic issue, and it's also a social issue because the Allied population, especially in France and Britain, are outraged by what has happened. They're outraged by the idea that Germany is just going to occupy these territories, exploit them, brutalize the people within them. This is absolutely intolerable, and it has to be ended as soon as possible. And there's another thing we're apt to forget, because we know what happens. We have the benefit of hindsight. But in early 1915, it's by no means apparent to the Allies that the Germans aren't going to attack again and aren't going to try and break through to Ypres or drive on Paris. In fact, the Germans think about it, but decide they don't have the manpower to do it. And so in a way, the battles of 1915, as well as having all this weight of expectation upon them for the reasons we've outlined, there's also an idea of we've got to strike the Germans before they strike us first.
Yeah, and this whole idea of posture, if you like, on the battlefield, I think underpins a lot of what goes on with the fighting, and again goes to the mindset of this constant Allied attacking. So, I mean, if we take this at its, I think at its most very simple level, and hopefully not over simple given the gravity of the subject we're talking about, by 1915, when the Germans have realised the Schlieffen Plan is going to fail, and with one or two notable exceptions, we're going to find, generally speaking, the Germans adopting a defensive posture on the Western Front. We've discussed it previously things like the Second Battle of Ypres, where there is a fairly limited attack, which does cause some real worry on the battlefield. Then, of course, you've got the two major attacks, one at Verdun, and then finally the famous Spring Offensive in 1918, which is a different story altogether. Apart from that, really, the Germans have, in essence, said, we've got as much ground as we're content with, capture most of Belgium, we've got important chunks of northern France, we're here to stay. In effect, if you want us to leave, you have to make us. Now, the point here is that the Belgians and the French and the British desperately want the Germans to leave. And the bottom line is, they're going to have to make them.
This is completely true. And just to add weight to that, the Germans know how valuable the terrain, the area that they've captured is. The German such as it is, German attempts to negotiate a peace deal. There are some German attempts to do this in 1915 and indeed beyond that we might touch on later. Almost everything anchors on Belgium. The fact that Germany occupies 90% of Belgium is huge. There's various proposals the Germans have to say, well, we'll give part of Belgium back. That will appease the Brits. What the French are going to get is another question. But we're never giving up all of Belgium. It's too valuable to us. We're going to keep part of Belgium. Now, in a way, this isn't economic value. Belgium is actually poorer than the parts of France they've occupied, but it's the psychological value that Germany occupies almost all of Belgium and feels it can do a deal with it. And so much of German strategy is actually anchored on the idea of we must defend Belgium at all costs. This is our political bargaining chip, especially with Britain. The Germans sometimes entertain wild fantasies that if they evacuate Belgium and they hand it over to the British will be willing to make peace with them. It's not going to happen, but it's an idea they pursue. And Belgium also gives Germany an opportunity to strike at Britain directly, whether that's through launching air raids, especially in 1917, or more importantly, operating U-boat pens in the Belgian ports, which of course ravage Allied shipping, especially in 1917. So if you don't have Belgium as the Germans, then that's a real strategic blow. It's a real economic blow. And of course, it's a political blow. You're not going to be able to do the deal that you hope to do with Britain. So the Germans are just as determined to defend Belgium and France, or occupy Belgium and France, I should say, as the Allies are to liberate them. Neither side is willing to compromise. Until later in the war, Germany is not willing to trade space for time in the West. It wants to hold every single yard of ground it has gained in its initial invasion. And that means that the stakes are just as high for the defender as they are for the attacker. And when you have that kind of match between two powers, where both powers are utterly committed to objectives that cannot exist with one another, you're going to get very, very, very intense fighting. And the tragedy for the Allied cause, I think, is that in 1914, they, of course, have defeated the Germans. They defeated them at the Battle of the Marne, turned them back, and then they've held the line at the Battle of Ypres in autumn 1914. And tragically, I think the Allies draw two understandable but misleading conclusions from those battles. The first comes from the Marne, and that is the idea that attacked with sufficient force, and this is an idea the French particularly draw upon, attacked with sufficient force, the Germans can be defeated and they can be pushed back. They're a very formidable army, no doubt, but they're not superhuman. They can be defeated if we attack them with enough force. So attacks in 1915 can succeed, is the lesson that's drawn from that. From the British perspective, the experience at First Ypres, where the British really hang on by their fingernails, incredibly bitter fighting where the outcome is decided by just a handful of men at certain times, handful of brave soldiers holding the line or counterattacking. It's a really desperate fight, proportionately the bloodiest battle the British Army fights on the Western Front. But the conclusion that the British High Command draws from this, they know how close they've come to being broken at First Ypres. I mean, it really has hung in the balance. It's been a matter of minutes at times. The conclusion they draw from this is that if you can just put in a little more effort, if you can just put in an extra reserve at the right time, then you can swing the tide of battle in your favour. Rather than drawing the conclusion that even a handful of determined officers and men can hold up a much larger force, instead they think, well, if you just push hard enough with enough materials and resources, then you will overcome the defense. And so the Allies draw two incorrect ideas from 1914. Understandable, perhaps, but it's going to inform them in 1915 when they begin their real assaults on the Western Front. There have been attacks on the Western Front in late 14, but they're small scale. In 15, you're going to see bigger and bigger and bigger attacks on the Western Front. And the tragedy for the Allies, Dan, of course, is that just about all of these attacks go horribly wrong.
Yeah, I mean, we've covered it a couple of times before now, but there's no real way to sweeten what is a horrific year of the war for the Allies. 1915, by all accounts. It's very hard to draw any positives, certainly any big-scale positives on the story of the Great War. Perhaps, if we're really stretching it, the only thing that I can maybe springs to mind for me is the fact that the Allies realise that time can be on their side, and exerting pressure on a broader sphere could also be effective. And of course, we're going to have to bring in the story of the Eastern Front here as well. Backdrop to that, remember, of course, One thing Germany is desperate to avoid at all costs if a major European war is to break out is to be fighting on multiple different fronts at the same time. Desperate to avoid a Western and an Eastern front, which is, of course, by 1915 exactly what they get. Doesn't mean it's plain sailing on the Western Front. Far from it. There are a number of major attacks that go in. I think some of them are perhaps suffer from coordination problems. Some of them suffer from much more basic problems at a tactical level, just not getting the tactics right. Remember, the advantages that the defender can hold when in a well-entrenched position compared to an attacker who at that point is limited with resources, limited with the amount of technology that they can bring to bear on the battlefield, the same things that we see proven very effective in 1918. You know, one of the questions we quite regularly get given, Spence, when I'm out on the battlefield is, well, why didn't they try and use some kind of new tactics, you know, to break through at the Battle of Neuchâtel or Loos or Festubert or Orbers Ridge? Well, the simple answer is they don't exist at that point. There's very limited things that you can do. There's limited manpower, there's limited guns, there's no existence of tanks, there's no flamethrowers, aircraft are in tiny numbers. I mean, there's not really a lot that you can say for 1915 other than we're finding out in a fairly brutal way that brute forcing your way through a well-constructed, well-manned and deep enemy defensive position is just not going to work.
This is really, really true. The tragedy of 1915 for the Allied cause is that just about everything that can go wrong does go wrong. The French, of course, much larger army, much better equipment than the British Army in 1915. It launches a series of huge offensives throughout 1915. And although there's some hints that they might succeed, the French attack at Vimy Ridge in May 1915 comes close to doing something quite impressive, but is ultimately defeated. For the most part, the French offensives in 1915 are an absolute bloody disaster. France loses more men in 1915 than any other single year of the Great War. But of course, it's impelled to keep launching these attacks because this is France that must be liberated. This is their homeland that must be defended. And so the army keeps throwing itself at these German defences. And then tied to this is Britain, which of course is the smaller of the powers and feels it has to do its part. So we mentioned earlier, great point, this is an Allied war effort. Britain can't sit back and look at France and indeed Russia, who we'll come on to in a moment, and say, you know, we're really sorry, but our army needs a lot of time to prepare itself. We can't come to your aid. Ironically, the original British strategy as formulated by Lord Kitchener had relied on the Russians and the French really bearing the brunt of war until 1917, by which time a new British army would be ready for action. But the casualties in 1914, the German occupation of large portions of Belgium and France, it throws this calculation out the window. You cannot say to your allies who are engaged in a life and death struggle, where their independence is at stake. You can't say to them, well, we're not ready. We're not really going to help you. You guys bear the brunt of fighting for as long as you can. And, you know, we'll join you when's possible. And so the British Army on the Western Front has to play its role in these offensives, even though it ends up attacking in places and times it doesn't really want to. But it's an Allied war effort, and as the junior partner, it has to play its role. And it's even more poorly equipped than the French. And if the French can't break through with their superior resources, then there's very little hope that the British are going to do anything better. And of course, so it plays out. And there's a third factor, or even a third and a fourth factor in this, and that's what's happening in the East, because, of course, there's another ally at war. There's actually two allies at war in the East, Serbia and Russia, who are both part of the Allies. And both of these nations are under heavy assault in 1915. Serbia will actually be conquered, it'll be snuffed out by Germans and Austro-Hungarians, and Russia gets invaded. Russia, of course, rather different in 1914 and 15. Its empire extends and encompasses Poland. Russian Poland is completely overrun by the Central Powers in 1915, and the Russians undertake what they call the Great Retreat, a huge retreat inland, abandoning hundreds of miles of Russian territory to the invader. And of course, the message from St. Petersburg is quite stark and quite clarion. We need you to do something to relieve the pressure on us. Attack the Germans. Do something to pin them down, which, of course, contributes to this need to just continuously attack in 1915, even though tactically, and you made a great point, Dan, I know we'd like to cover this in a future episode, tactically, there just isn't the options there for the Allies that are going to achieve a breakthrough. And at the end of 1915, it's impossible not to look back on this year in the West and say, gosh, what a cost for so little gained. And we've mentioned before on the podcast the Battle of Ober's Ridge, which proportionately is one of the worst single days of the war for the British Army.
Yeah, and talking about the Eastern Front in particular, it's maybe sometimes difficult to look at Britain, who are, as you rightly say, absolutely a junior partner. They're not calling the big shots here. They're making major contributions, a lot of them financial. But to figure out how Britain is really going to materially help somebody like Russia out on the Eastern Front is maybe a difficult thing to understand. There is, though, in April of 1915, one thing which comes directly to mind, and it's a good example of things that do not go right in 1915, albeit the concept perhaps isn't a bad one. And that, of course, is the landing and the subsequent brutal fight and then ultimate withdrawal from Gallipoli. So for those that are not so familiar with the idea behind the Gallipoli invasion, it's an area known as the Dardanelles, which is a spit of land, in effect, which has a strait of water running right through it, and it goes into the Black Sea, which is in the southern part of the Russian peninsula. In effect, what happens here is the Ottoman Empire are occupying that area, who, of course, are on the Central Powers side. Now, the Ottomans have been on the ropes for quite some time. They're a shadow of their former self, and they're really seen as the weaker partner in that kind of three major partner pact with the Austro-Hungarians and, of course, the Germans in the Central Powers. And the idea here is by knocking the Ottoman Empire out of the war, the Russians are going to have access to an ice-free port in the south, which is going to be fantastic for them. It means that resources and supplies from this British real domination of the seas can be sent eastwards, but at the same time, it's going to add excruciatingly more pressure on the Central Powers. So that the concept is not a bad one. In order to achieve that, the Brits are going to sail part of their huge naval fleet through the Dardanelles Straits. They're going to go up to and bombard Constantinople, the capital of the Ottoman Empire, smash it to smithereens, force the Ottomans out of the war, and hopefully then bring that extra pressure to bear. Now, the problem here is that initial naval attempts to force the Dardanelles Straits is not successful. As a result, a land campaign is taken over, the idea being to capture those straits, capture the spit of land with a land-borne campaign, and then allow your ships to float around and do exactly what we've just described. The problem is the Ottomans have not read the script, the terrain is horrendous, the fighting is awful, very bloody, and very, very difficult, and ultimately, Spence, what might be a bright idea on paper really turns out to be a real problem for the Western allies.
It does, and Gallipoli is, I think, as we mentioned previously, we'd love to do almost a mini-series on Gallipoli in the future because it's just a fascinating but also a ghastly campaign. And the decision for the British to commit resources to Gallipoli in 1915 is a deeply controversial one, not only in Britain but also with the Allies, because Britain ultimately doesn't have the military power to fight a major campaign on one front, let alone trying to open a second front down at Gallipoli. And it fails completely, of course. The Turks are triumphant. The British are eventually forced to evacuate. But it just sends a message, a controversial message, particularly to the French, that the British aren't really committed to the war in Europe. They're looking for the easy way out in French eyes. Looks rather different to the Russians, it has to be said, because the Russians quite appreciate the British efforts to draw off Turkish forces. Russia's also fighting Turkey in the Caucasus Mountains. But the failure of Gallipoli really means that there's no other choice now for the British. There's not going to be any adventures out in the Middle East. Everything now is going to have to be committed to the Western Front in 1916. But we've sort of laid out about what happens in 1915, the desperate Allied offensives in the West, all of which are defeated, the German conquest in the East. And I think it's worth just drawing out a point that we've hinted at, and that's, of course, that the Germans are not passive observers in this war. They've dug in on the Western Front, and they're bearing the brunt of Allied offensives, but elsewhere in the war, they are taking the fight to the Allies. There's a major U-boat campaign against Allied shipping in 1915, Zeppelin raids on Britain, and there's this massive German offensive against the Russians, which is extremely effective and successful. And that leads us to an important point about 1915 and indeed for subsequent years, but a question of what happens if the Allies don't do anything? Because I know I've had it put to me in seminar discussions, well, why didn't the Allies just stand and wait? The Germans aren't going to attack them. But time favours the Allies, or so it seems. You can build up your forces, get stronger and stronger and stronger, and then attack at a time of your choosing. But it's not that simple, because the Germans, if you're not doing anything to them, well, they're doing things to you. And so if the British and the French had just sat in their trenches and had not attacked in the West, what kind of message does that send to Russia? Basically, say, we don't care about you. We don't care that the Germans and the Austro-Hungarians are invading you and conquering your territory. We're not ready yet. We're going to wait. And one mortal fear of the Allies and one long-cherished dream of the Germans is one of the major Allied powers to get knocked out of the war. There's a real fear that if Russia gets knocked out of the war, Germany's just going to have too much fighting power for the French and the British to handle. And so there's this weight that if you don't do something, if you don't try and take the fight to the Germans, you're giving them a free hand and they can do absolutely anything they want and they're going to dictate the pace of the war. And so there's all these pressures lying on top of the Allied cause that we've already outlined. And it all means that the only answer to this is to attack. You have to try and do something, even if it's going to cost you very dearly. And just to add to that, even though 1915 is such a dreadful year for the Allies, it doesn't discourage them. Not really. It doesn't discourage the military. In fact, the military, both British and the French, come away from 1915 saying, well, that's been an extraordinarily violent and bloody experience. But we feel we've learned something. We feel that we can launch a more effective offensive in 1916, especially if we can coordinate it. And this gives rise to the decision to launch what's called the Allied General Offensive of 1916, where the British, the French, the Italians who've entered the war in 1915, and the Russians are all going to launch offensives that summer within a week or two of each other. And the idea is by attacking Germany from all sides, more or less simultaneously, you're going to overstretch the enemy. In 1915, that hadn't really happened. One side had launched an offensive, it would fail. The other side launched an offensive, it would fail. Didn't really coordinate. So the Allies are not necessarily discouraged at the end of 1915. They're chastened, I think, but not discouraged. And that leads to the Allied General Offensive. But of course, that will be disrupted by the Germans again, which I think really emphasizes that the point I've been making about Germany is an active player in this war, because they really take the French out of the General Offensive by attacking at Verdun in February 1916. Another battle I'd love to cover in depth, which means that the Allied General Offensive becomes a primarily British effort with French support on the Western Front rather than the other way around. But nevertheless, the Allied General Offensive, when it's launched in 1916, to political eyes, especially in Britain, it does not look very promising. It looks like 1915, but on a much larger scale. But to the military, although we often think in 1916 of the absolute inferno of the 1st of July and the terrible casualties that are suffered there, one thing the Allied General Offensive does is it does take the initiative away from the Germans. Suddenly the Germans are under real pressure. They're being attacked from multiple directions. It's intensely bloody, but it's not without its strategic effects on Germany. And I think here we see one of these deadly sort of balances of the First World War. How many lives, how many soldiers is it acceptable to expend if you're also inflicting damage on the enemy? And sitting here now in the 21st century, that's a very difficult calculation to make. But in 1916, the calculation is made rather differently. The British think, well, the army's still growing, it's still a formidable force, and we have to contribute, we have to play a role in this general offensive. And it's a difficult one, I think, for us to square now in our minds that expending 420,000 British casualties on the Somme may have reaped a strategic result. But that's how it's seen at the time, Dan.
Yeah, I mean, really, it's the heart of attritional warfare, isn't it, that you've just described there? The idea that you can afford to take more punishment, to soak up more punishment than your opponents can. And I know we haven't revisited this idea for a little while, but to go back to this analogy we used quite a while back now, where we looked at the idea of a poker player and the idea that the Western Allies, or Germany and Britain in this case, in effect have a two poker players sitting at a table, and they've got a particular hand that they can play. They're hoping that that hand is going to be able to defeat the enemies, whether it's on a tactical level on the battlefield or even a strategic one. But in order to do that, you need to put some chips down. You need to bet small, and maybe you're going to win small. Or you need to bet big, and maybe you're going to win big. Your idea being to get your opponent's stack of poker chips that they've got less to play the game with to run out. They're going to run out of chips. They're going to have no manpower left to put down. In this case, of course, those chips we're talking about are quite simply men, and in many cases, men's lives. So, if you bet big, like the first day of the Somme, 1916, you might lose big, and the Brits certainly learned that lesson in a very hard way. But the ultimate effect, though, is that it's not one hand, this poker game. It's many, many, many hands. And over a course of time, over a sustained course of time, if you play enough hands, the enemy is going to start to lose chips, little by little, whatever it might be. But the bottom line is the reserve that the Allies have got to draw, and it's just that bit bigger than the Germans. So this idea of wearing them down slowly and piece by piece, ideally in a coordinated manner, because Germany's not playing one player now, it's playing three players at the same table. So they've got to really, really work hard to husband and use their resources as best they can. And the Allied job really from this point forward is going to be to chip away. And, it's always going to be a bloody and difficult thing to do. And it's going to take time, and it's certainly going to take lives. But the intention to reuse a coined phrase, to bleed the French army white, which is a phrase supposedly used by the Germans to describe the fight at Verdun, in effect, it's the Allies that are trying to bleed the Germans white. That's the reality of the story. Although it's not going to take place over a single battle, it's going to take place over multiple years of battle, over thousands of miles of battlefield. Remember, Germany here has very finite resources. Britain, of course, has finite resources. Russia has finite resources, and so do the French. What we haven't included yet are the Americans, which is another story yet again. But the bottom line is the Germans have got only one pool that they can drag that manpower out of. They're fighting 100% or a good chunk of the Eastern Front. They're holding almost all of the Western Front. They're also fighting in other theatres at the same time. The Brits, by comparison, are fighting realistically on about 30% of the Western Front. That's the terrain that they're holding. They can put a lot more men and a lot more effort and resources into that sector, and the Germans have got to hold exponentially more ground. And so this idea of an attritional fight, which I think to modern eyes looks like an absolutely horrific idea and underpins much of what we're talking about here, it is a fairly sure bet. If you can keep the fight going long enough, really from 1916 onwards, this becomes nice and clear. If you can keep the fight going long enough, eventually the Germans are going to run out of gas, provided they don't manage to knock out one of the major players in the meantime, which of course is going to be a story that no doubt we'll cover in the rest of this. But I don't know, Spence, the whole idea here of, this land campaign and how it's just engulfing parts of Europe and all of the major nations are really drawing breath, thinking, right, we're just going to slug it out here and see who's going to drop first. There's an element of that. There's another point that we can bring into this as well, which I think actually plays a part in the land story, even though it's not one that takes part on land. And that's, of course, looking at the naval blockade, and in particular, and it works on two sides here. You've got the German assault on Allied shipping, particularly on Britain, which is a really high risk as an isolated island nation. But at the same time, the fact that Germany relies on naval imports and Britain has a substantial and very effective navy.
This is true because the attritional war, as you've rightly said, Dan, isn't just taking place on land. The naval aspect of the First World War is crucial to it, that the Royal Navy's managed to effectively choke off Germany from world markets. Some blockade running, there's some shipping that gets to neutral Netherlands and then is shipped to Germany by land. But essentially, Germany's dependent on what it can acquire via overland routes, certainly by early 1915, which is eroding particularly its food base. We've discussed problems with German rationing in the past. German rations are falling slowly but surely from the moment they're introduced in January 1915. And by the end of the war, they're sub 1,000 calories a day, which is livable on, but you're going to lose a lot of weight and it's going to be grueling and depressing for you. So there's that economic weight that is on top of Germany. And of course, Germany tries to fight back as well, strikes back, takes the offensive at sea against Britain with its U-boats in what's effectively a counter-blockade, attempting to starve or at least seriously disrupt the British economy. And though it doesn't really have much success with that in strategic terms in 1915, it will, of course, revisit this idea in 1917 and launch a really devastating U-boat offensive against the British Isles, which I'd love to do in a future podcast. And what all this emphasizes is the totality of war in 1916, and indeed earlier and later, that everybody's using every weapon at their disposal to try and crack this. When we talk about constantly attacking on the Western Front, the war is being fought in multiple dimensions. It's fought at sea, it's fought in the air, it's fought in a propaganda sphere. People are trying to influence their own populations, influence the enemy's population, and influence neutral opinion. It's all out because the stakes are rising. And that idea that the stakes are rising is important because one of the tragedies, in a way, of 1915 is that it has been so bloody, that the battles have been so costly with so little result. Because perversely, it means it's less likely there's going to be a compromise peace that might have ended the war earlier. Because how do you turn around, if you're the French government, and say to the French population, who've just suffered over 1 million casualties, 2 million casualties, really, by the start of 1916, and say, I'm really sorry, those 2 million casualties we've suffered, well, the war's ending now. The Germans are going to give us our occupied territories back, and we're going to go back to the state that we were before the war, which is what Germany would really like. That's Germany's main peace proposal through 15 and 16. If any government that said that to the population in 1916, and the same is probably true in Britain, that government is going to be brought down. That the people are not prepared to compromise. You can't ask society to make such huge sacrifices and then tell them, well, bad luck. Nothing's really happened. We're going to go back to how it was just before the war with no punishment for this invading nation that has caused all this chaos. And so chance of compromise become less and less and less the higher the casualties go. And so there's this sort of self-fulfilling prophecy. The more the Allies attack and the more casualties they suffer, the less likely they are to be willing to accept a compromise peace. And this also puts Germany in really a strategic no-win situation. Because by 16, as they're facing the general offensive and they're being hit from all sides, Germany goes through a period of strategic worry. How can we hold off the Russians, the British, the Italians? How can we keep fighting at Verdun? And the answer is pretty bleak. Well, we're going to have to give up some ground. We're going to have to consolidate our defenses. But the even bleaker question at the end of 1916 for the Germans is, well, how do we win the war? The line holds against the Allied general offensive. In fact, the German army fights extraordinarily hard and very impressively in 1916, holds off the Allies on all fronts ultimately. But what a cost it suffers in doing so. And crucially, the idea that the German High Command has for 1917 is, well, just more of the same. We're not going to launch our attacks ourselves. We're just going to try and hold the line. And there's this nebulous, never really articulated hope that eventually the Allies will just batter themselves to death on the Western Front, that they'll exhaust themselves, that the governments will collapse, that the governments will be forced to make a compromise peace when they see the impossibility of breaching the Western Front. And I'm actually reminded of another army in a losing position that tried this, and that was the Confederate Army, particularly the Confederate Army of Northern Virginia in the American Civil War in 1864. Of course, it's post-Gettysburg. There's not really a prospect of carrying the war into the North again. So the Confederates try and fight a grueling defensive campaign to try and bleed the Union Army and hope there's going to be a political change, that Abraham Lincoln will be defeated because the casualties are so high, and a pro-peace candidate, actually a former commander, George McClellan, will be elected. And in a way, Germany is playing from the same playbook. We're just going to hold in the West. We're going to turn it into a fortress. It already is a fortress. We're going to refortify it. We're going to fall back to the Hindenburg Line, this incredibly sophisticated defensive network. The Allies will never get through this. They'll bleed themselves to death. And at some point, the Allied governments will throw in the towel. They won't. The cost will be too much. Their populations will rise up. Their politicians will balk at the cost. And that's going to be it. And you know, Dan, the Germans come somewhat close to achieving this. And I'm particularly thinking about the unfortunate fate of the French army in April 1917.
Yeah, I mean, the French are in a real bad position by 1917. I want to go back to just one point that you've made there before we just get into the French here, Spence, because it's an interesting point. And I think maybe this is a benefit of hindsight. Maybe it's a little bit of looking back at this through the historical lens. But typically, defenders don't win wars. Holding a defensive posture and maintaining a defensive posture. Yes, it's not impossible that the Allies might batter themselves to pieces. It's also possible they might just continue to wear you down. And 1916, whilst it is in some senses a defensive victory for the Germans, it's not one that they can repeat indefinitely. And this is part of this big kind of attritional picture. And particularly because of the experiences of 1960. If all things were equal and nobody learned from anything that they did in action, yeah, you could possibly argue that. But the British Army, the French Army, the Russian Army, the Australians, Canadians, and eventually the Americans, when they arrive, they're learning lessons all the time. So you're not fighting the same army, you're not fighting the same way. And what we start to see is these tactical improvements on the battlefield start swaying the battle. The defender's edge is perhaps not taken away, but ever so slowly ground down, and it becomes something more like parity. And in that situation, as far as I see it, really from 1916 onwards, the Germans are in a really bad state unless they change, they roll the dice and try something new. And there's a glimmer, as you've just alluded to, that comes out in 1917, because, of course, they've always got the Hail Mary of one of the three big powers dropping out. This could happen at any point, and it totally shifts the balance of power if that does happen. And when we look inside the French army, for example, in 1917, who are going to launch the largest attack for quite some time, and it's going to take place in April of that year. And it's going to be famously, for those looking through a British lens, going to be associated to the Battle of Arras. Of course, it's the French naval offensive. This is going to be a brand new attempt to smash through and defeat the German army in very short order. So we think we've got some new tactics. We think we've got a new way of fighting. We think we're going to be able to break through and shatter the German lines once and for all. Well, the bottom line is it doesn't work. And it doesn't work in a very, very painful way for the French army. So painful, in fact, that on top of the brutal losses of 1914 and 1915, as well as the horrific fighting that's been going on around Verdun, a good chunk, not all of, and it's certainly not wholesale, but a good chunk of the French army says, don't ask us to do that again, at least not for a while. This is the famous, in inverted commas, French mutiny of 1917. I don't think we've covered this yet so far on the podcast, Spence, but it's a very interesting one. I don't think mutiny is the right word to use. I'm not in agreement that the French army mutinies in that sense. What in effect they say, or good chunks of the French army say, is don't ask us to attack. Don't ask us to go out of our trenches, drive the enemy back. We've seen too much of this, it's gone too wrong, and it's cost too many lives. Ask us to defend, ask us to hold our positions, yes, we'll stay and we'll do it. But for a period of time, Spence, and thankfully the Germans don't get wind of this in the way that had they done, things could have been very different. For a period of time, the French army is in absolute turmoil, and there are some real big problems. Thankfully, the Germans don't seem to quite grasp just how serious the situation is.
This is a really interesting point because although the French army spasms and there's indiscipline, there's perhaps at the very fringes, there's what would be a really formal mutiny that may even culminate with laying down arms. That's only an absolute few fringe rabble-rousers who are dealt with fairly quickly. The point you've made that this is it's even been described by historians as a sort of workplace strike. That doesn't trivialize it too much. Just a protest against how the army is being treated, just being thrown into battle as it feels it cannot win. It's not being given a fair chance. And of course, it culminates this series of offensives that begins for the French really at the Marne in 1914. It's gone through 15, a bloodbath. It's gone through 16 with Verdun and also the Somme bloodbaths. And then in 17, it feels as it's being asked to do the impossible. And its offensive power, although it's not completely taken away, there are French offensives in 1917, not least French contributions to the Battle of Passchendaele, the ability of the French to launch unilateral, entirely French offensives on a very large scale is gone until 1918. And it shows in a way the cost of these offensives, because we were talking just previously about 1916 and the balance of power, that in an attritional war, the Germans are always going to lose just because there's more Allied manpower. They're going to grind the Germans down, and the Allies know this. And if they can just keep attacking the Germans, then eventually the Germans must crack. On pure mathematics, that has to happen. And I think the French mutiny, and I will call it a mutiny just for simplicity of language, is an indicator that it's not just about numbers. It's also about intangibles. It's about morale. It's about psychology. It's about a sense of fairness. Is the army being treated correctly and fairly? And the fact the French army goes to this spasm where, in a way, it's just being driven to destruction at this stage does show the cost of these continuous offensives. And again, I'd love to revisit in a future episode the long-term effects of this mutiny, not only on the French, but on the British, because it also puts the British under huge pressure. The British pretty quickly perceive there's something wrong with the French, and French secretly inform the British about what's happened. And the British are horrified. The British actually see it as a much bigger incident than it probably really is. The British are very worried about, well, what happens if the Germans get wind of this and attack the French? The Germans never do get wind of it. And to be honest, I think if the Germans had attacked the French, I think the French would have fought very hard. They'd have fought very hard in the defensive. They just didn't want to be used in major offensives anymore. But the British don't know this, and they feel, well, we have to now bear the brunt of war. We have to carry the fight to the Germans because we're the only power left that can really do this. The Russians in 1917 are falling apart. The Tsar's abdicated. The Germans are launching offensives there. It's going to culminate with Russia collapsing into the Bolshevik Revolution in the latter part of the year. The Americans have entered the war, but they're not going to be on the Western Front in large numbers until summer 18. So it's only the British that can keep fighting. And so there's all these pressures on Britain to keep launching offensives. You've got to help the French. You've got to help the Russians. You've got to prevent the Germans having a free hand. But there's also another element to these attacks, Dan, and that's the fact that the British actually, you alluded to this point really importantly earlier, the British are getting better at attacking. Their attacks are beginning to reach a stage where they can pretty reliably, not always, but pretty reliably break into the German defences. And I'm thinking particularly about the capture of Vimy Ridge by the Canadians in April 1917 and a battle we discussed previously, the detonation of the mines under Messines Ridge, which are giving hope to the British offensive efforts.
Yeah, and there's a crucial point to make here, and we see this really clearly in 1917, particularly if we look at the idea of break-in against breakthrough. Break-in in 1917 is absolutely achievable. Can you get into the enemy defences? Yes. Can you inflict casualties on them? Absolutely. Can you grab little bits of ground? Yep, that can be done too. Can we break through them? Or, in fact, are we trying to break through them? That's a question that's still not been asked and answered in 1917. But these little hammer blows that are striking the Germans consecutively, causing them to shift their ever worsening manpower situation behind the lines to go in and plug gaps where it looks like there's dangerous areas. The Brits in 1917, to my mind, do a very good job of that. We see it, first of all, even as early as April, as you said, Spence. So the Canadian Army does very well up on the Vimy Ridge. Particularly, it's a set-piece action. Really excellent artillery, British artillery employed there to really smash that ridge up and offer attacking infantry some real protection. There's good success. In fact, to the south of that, on the opening day of the Battle of Arras, again, there's very good progress made. This is progress that's been learned by the very costly lessons of the 2 years before. We see exactly the same thing in 1917, but it's perhaps more successful further up in the area around Messines, so the southern part of the Ypres salient. This is, again, a set-piece action. It's really, if you like, the initial part, the fledgling elements of all-arms warfare. We see mining under the ridge. We see a really strong artillery plan in place. We see infantry that's training behind the lines, knowing exactly what they've got to do. So at this stage now, we're also starting to trust junior ranks, and this is really important. So it's no longer colonels and generals just setting the idea, sending troops off and saying, do the best you can. Troops at lower ranks are actually starting to really have an impact on the battlefield. All of these elements are really proving on the battlefield that success can be achieved, and it's getting more and more costly. The Germans typically do stop most of these offensives, but it's getting very costly to do so, and it's a cost they quite simply can't afford. And by the time we get to the end of July 1917, the situation at least from the British perspective, is not looking too bad. And that's true for the first time in quite some time. It sets up, of course, the major offensive that's going to take place in 1917. This is going to be the epitome of attritional warfare. It's going to turn into a horrific bloodbath and potentially one that goes on too long for both sides. It's, of course, the battle that today we call Passchendaele.
It is. And we've covered Passchendaele in its own episode previously in the series, but you made a great lead into this, that from a British military perspective, there's hope that Passchendaele will work. There's been a big advance at the opening of Arras. There's been success at Messines Ridge. The army is clearly better. It has better equipment. It has better training. It feels like it's on an upward curve as it enters the Passchendaele campaign. And in combination with that need to support its allies, France obviously racked with internal military dissent, Russia collapsing and being crushed effectively, Britain has to attack, but it feels it can do so with some confidence. And the tragedy of this from a political perspective is the Prime Minister who we started this podcast with, David Lloyd George, he does not believe in the Passchendaele offensive. He doesn't really believe in offensives on the Western Front at all. From his non-military perspective, he just doesn't see the cost benefit of these attacks. He just sees a huge casualty list of British and British Empire soldiers for the gaining of a few miles of ground, which to his mind is pretty worthless. He's much more interested in trying to find a soft spot. He thinks the Italian front might be a soft spot. He's probably completely wrong in that. It's not going to work. He also thinks that more effort should be put into defeating the Ottomans as a precursor to then opening up a southern front against the Germans. He's looking everywhere but the Western Front. The tragedy for him is he can't really make that argument when it seems like all roads lead to Passchendaele. The British have to try and do something to support the French and the Russians, and the British military thinks it can do something quite big based on its previous successes. And so another attack goes in, and of course we have covered Passchendaele, bloody, controversial to this day. But one point to make about Passchendaele is the casualties. The British Empire does suffer more casualties than the Germans, somewhere in the region of 250,000 casualties. But the Germans suffer very close to that in return. Slightly low, I think it's about 230,000 from memory. But otherwise, casualty-wise, it's quite close. Compare and contrast, say, the battles of 1915, where the casualties, for example, Ober's Ridge, May 1915, British and Indian forces suffer about 11,500 casualties. German casualties, perhaps as low as 1,000 men. Incredible misbalance of casualties. Whereas by the time of 1917, suddenly, even if the Germans do regard Passchendaele as a great defensive victory, but my God, it's almost a Pyrrhic victory. You can't actually keep winning battles like that because your army's just going to be ground into dust. And although it's taken years and millions of casualties, by 1917, you made a great point that the advantage is beginning slowly to turn back towards the attacker. You have more advanced artillery, you have tanks, you have ground support aircraft, and slowly the balance between attacker and defender is edging in favour of the attacker. And of course, there's also the sort of strategic weight that is lying on Germany by 1917, because on one hand, they have defeated Russia, but on the other hand, they've brought in a new enemy, the United States, which basically is almost a like-for-like replacement in certain respects in terms of manpower at least. And it's interesting when we think about Lloyd George's criticism we started this podcast with, that the offensive gripped generals like a disease of the mind. There had to be a better way. It's interesting that the Germans by 1918 think that they have to attack too. And this, I think, speaks to a truth that I think we keep touching on in this podcast. And that's that as bloody as it is to attack in the First World War, as costly as it is, it's also the only way you're going to win the war. The German idea they're going to fight the Allies to a standstill is ultimately not possible by the end of 1917. They know this. They suffered heavily at Passchendaele, though they've held the line. They know there's masses of fresh American troops, highly motivated, ready to fight, arriving. The Germans can't count on holding the line much indefinitely. They're going to be broken at some point. And so in 1918, they decide that the only way to win the war is an all-out offensive. In fact, the biggest offensive the Germans have launched on the Western Front since the initial invasion in 1914.
It is, and it's going to be, this is the proverbial last roll of the dice, albeit it's still a good period of time before the war is actually going to come to an end. Another thing we should point out here is that by the end of the Passchendaele offensive, not only have the Germans suffered at a rate that really, German armies looking at Passchendaele and saying, yeah, okay, that's a kind of defensive victory in our eyes, but we don't want any more of those. We certainly don't. Although that manpower issue at least is temporarily offset by the end of 1917, with, of course, with the closing of the Eastern Front. And now we get this, if you look at the set of scales on the manpower sheet, for the time being, the Germans have just got a great big heavy weight and they've plonked it down on their side of the scales. And for the first time in a very long time, that weight, that balance has shifted. Now, it's only going to be a temporary shift because eventually the Americans are going to come on and just going to keep piling weight onto the Allied side in an unstoppable torrent. But that's not happening yet. And so the Germans, bear in mind as well, they're really starting to feel the pinch at home, and that's now filtering out onto the battlefields in terms of the naval blockade, which is really starting to reduce the quality, maybe not the quantity just yet, but the quality of men that can fight on the battlefield. They see an opportunity. They see a very tired France, a very tired Britain, and they see that for once they've got numbers on their side. And they're going to roll the dice, and that dice is going to get rolled on the 21st of March, 1918. We used, I think, when we originally discussed this, Spence, in our two-parter on the spring offensive, the idea of an old West-style saloon door, a swinging door. Now, the Germans, what they want to do is push on the middle of those doors, and they want to swing the Brits and the French apart, ideally split them into two parts and attack and break them up in one at a time, basically, piecemeal. In fact, all they have to do realistically is knock one of those two out of the war and everything changes. But they have to do it before the Americans can arrive, and arrive in serious numbers. Therefore, the spring offensive has a very important clock running. If you imagine your visuals of the spring offensive of 1918, there's definitely a stopwatch running in the top corner of that screen, because everybody knows what the situation is going to be. And Spence, time is absolutely key for this offensive.
It is, and this lends weight to the discussions that we've been having in this episode. And one of the reasons that time is running out for the Germans is the years of war up until this point has drained Germany. It's drained it of manpower. Those offensives have been bloody for the Allies, but they've been bloody for the German army too. And the German army, by 1918, though it has this huge influx of manpower from the east, and it's still a tremendously powerful fighting force, incredibly powerful, it's not perhaps as powerful as when it's at its peak. Its peak perhaps late 15, early 16. You've got lots and lots of pre-war experienced trained officers and so forth. That army's been ground down. And so when we think, are the offensives of 1915, 16, 17 fruitless? In a long term, they're probably not, because they do force the German army to fight. They inflict damage upon it, even as the Allies take damage in return. And it's not a pleasant concept to consider, but in a mass war of nations where the nations involved are relatively of similar strengths, you have to grind one side down. You have to reduce that side's strength and power. The problem, of course, for the Germans, and in a way this goes back to the offensives that are being launched against them, is that in 1917, they've introduced their unrestricted U-boat blockade of Britain, full in the knowledge that that will bring the United States into the war. And one of the reasons the Germans do that is they need a way to try and hurt Britain. They know that the British Empire is going to get stronger and stronger and stronger as the war goes on, and its economy becomes more and more mobilized. They also know that the British Army has got a lot better just during the Somme campaign. From that disaster on the 1st of July to November 1916, the British Army has improved. So how do you hurt the British? How do you try and remove them from the war? Well, maybe you can strangle them with U-boats. That doesn't work. It brings America into the war too. And that really completely destroys any German calculation of just fighting the Allies to exhaustion, because the Americans are going to pour millions of troops in. They're fresh, they're highly motivated, and the Germans know they can't handle that. And so, as you say, Dan, this ticking clock starts. Can the Germans inflict a shattering defeat on the British and the French before the Americans arrive? And we've covered this, of course, in a two-parter, in fact, that the short answer is they can't. They can inflict massive blows against the British and the French, inflict enormous casualties, capturing tens of thousands of British and French soldiers, advancing the furthest anybody's advanced on the Western Front since it began. But what they can't do is break either army or capture strategic cities that are going to cripple logistics. And in the end, the German offensive, it does not achieve what it wants to do. Effectively, it breaks up the Western Front, or breaks up large portions of it, inflicts a lot of casualties, but suffers a lot of casualties in return, and leaves the German army in a vulnerable position, a bit like somebody who's overcommitted to a tackle in football, and the ball is just going to roll away from them, and then the opposition's going to take it down the other end and score. We do like a good sporting metaphor on this podcast. But the fact that the Germans feel they have to abandon the strategy they've had for 3 years on the Western Front of standing on the defensive, Verdun accepted, of course, to try and win the war with an all-out offensive, I think speaks of the fact that you cannot win a war without launching an offensive. You're just, in a war like this, you're just not going to fight a side to exhaustion. There has to be some way you turn the tide and inflict real blows against the enemy. And the reason the Germans have to do it in 1918 is they know they cannot endure more attrition, more grinding, more battering that's going to come, especially with the Americans on top. And it reminds me of a quote from, in fact, one of Prussia's most famous military philosophers, perhaps the most famous military philosopher of all time, Karl von Clausewitz. He was writing in the 1820s, and he noted that it was possible to fight on the defensive in a war, but you couldn't win a war doing that. Eventually, you'd have to turn the tables. And he coined this in a great phrase when he said, if you fight purely on the defensive, you suffer war, not make it. And in a way, on the Western Front, the Germans had suffered war for most of 1915, 16, and 17. And the consequences of that were they had to take this huge gamble in 1918 because they just couldn't last any longer standing on the defensive. And in that sense, I think, Dan, can we say that the attrition, as ghastly as it is, the attrition of 15, 16, and 17 leads to the victory in 18?
I think we can, in all honesty. You know, it's not a straight line, and it's certainly not only on the Western Front, but that combination of factors that we've heard about. It's the idea of the naval blockade reducing the quality of troops. It's the fact that the Germans have been forced to fight for year after year, at the same time as the Allies, of course, learning lessons and becoming more effective in what they do. It's you know, one of the famous balances that can nullify numbers to a certain extent, really through 1915 to 1917, is the fact that trench warfare can be a force multiplier for the defender. If you're in a trench with solid barbed wire, as we discussed in the last episode, you can improve the defensive elements around you. You can hold off a much larger force. Now, by 1918, the Allies, ironically, have seen this because the Germans have shown them how to do it, how to break through trench warfare. And at this stage, with the Germans having advanced but overextended, having now not got those formidable defensive positions because they're basically in virgin ground to a certain extent, certainly in given areas, they're now left in a very vulnerable position with the Allies now with the manpower and the resources and the artillery and the tanks and the tactics on the ground to actually inflict those defeats. The perfect storm as far as the Allied assault of the final assault of the Great War is kind of all coming together. We're looking at an exhausted German army that's starved of manpower, starved of food, starved of resources against an ever-growing Allied force. And realistically, this attack here is going to be the one that absolutely puts the nail in the coffin as far as the war on the Western Front goes. Although you could argue the Germans have already tapped that into the lid, at least in March 1918, when they tried to roll that famous last go of the dice.
And the culmination as well, I think, in 1918, for both the Germans and for the Allies, in the way the war is fought. We've mentioned many times on this podcast just how revolutionary war looks in 1918 compared to 1914. We know this because the soldiers who fight in 1914 and are still fighting in 18, even they reflect about how much war has changed. There's machines that just didn't exist outside imagination now on the battlefield. The way that armies fight and conduct themselves is completely different. And to get to that stage, to actually have that innovation, to have those developments, you have to have gone through all the battles between 14, 15, 16, and 17. You have to have had that grueling, bloody learning experience. Are there better ways to have learned? Well, I'm sure there are. But ultimately, this was the way that the war had to be fought. armies had to devise new methods for carrying out these offensives. And eventually they do. The Germans relying on massive artillery and stormtroopers, the Allies relying on combined arms, artillery, aircraft, and tanks. Both effective in their own way. The Allied method probably more effective. It's the method that we still use to this day. But the Allies could not have got there without that offensive effort. And a point that we actually made in the 100 Days episode is that even with all this manpower, the American manpower, a reinvigorated French army, battle-hardened British and British Empire army, all armies well equipped with vehicles and artillery, even with all those advantages, the Germans still fight incredibly hard in the 100 Days. 100 Days is a very bloody and hard-fought campaign, even though it ultimately ends in a complete Allied victory. And one wonders, if the German army had not suffered such heavy casualties defending the Western Front, holding on, if it had not been exposed to all that attrition, both on the battlefield and economically, maybe it could have held on in the autumn of 1918. Even if it only lasted into 1919, maybe that would have been enough to get the Germans a political deal. Probably not. But it does show that the battles of the early part of the war weren't in vain. And I think there's a temptation for us to just look at the end of the war and go, well, it was obvious. Tanks, aircraft, artillery, highly skilled infantry, lots of ammunition. It's going to work. I think that the Allies are aware of this. In fact, I can say for certain they're aware of this. But actually making that a reality on the battlefield is much, much harder than it seems just sat here in the 21st century. We can all be armchair generals. We can all say, well, obviously we'd do that. But actually making it work on a vast scale with millions of soldiers is really difficult. And without those grueling, bloody experiences, I don't think it would have worked at all in 1918.
No, quite simply, you don't get the army of 1918 if there's not been an army of 17, 16, 15 before that. I think what you say there, Spence, is absolutely correct. And I suppose as we come to round this one up and reflect on that initial question, why do the Allies keep attacking on the Western Front when all the advantages seem to lie with the defender? I think the short answer is, as painful as it might be, well, they have to. In order to win the war, they have to do that. And, reflecting on the other point I think we made at the very start of this, and this is always one that I think we owe ourselves to come back to, those lessons that are learned and those offensives, they're not free. They come with a cost. They come with a huge cost. And of course, it's a human one. And that in many ways, for me, I think is why this idea of, if you like, futility and waste on the Western Front is so prevalent in modern society. We look at these things and we don't see that, great-great-uncle Sid, who died in 1915, was actually part of the building block that led to victory 2 or 3 years later. The reality is they are. But for the loved ones at home, it sure as hell don't feel like that.
No, and this speaks to perhaps a follow-up to this, and this is to do with how the view of the war changes. So for all the casualties and all the destruction and the violence and the carnage, at the end of 1918, the Allies celebrate victory. They feel they have won. They finally overthrown Germany. They have liberated the territories. The German army has been crushed. And despite German propaganda to the contrary, the war is over. Peace is going to settle over Europe. And there is a sense of victory. And it actually lasts several years into the 1920s. But then that sense of victory begins to be eroded because the peacetime Europe is not prosperous. There's political tensions almost immediately. There's economic downturn. There's no roaring 20s in Britain or France. There's a lot of economic hardship. And faced with that, there's the inevitable question, well, was it worth it? Was it worth this sacrifice? Could there have been a better way? And it's been said that the nations in Europe are in a sort of delayed form of shock in the 1920s that only really breaks around about 1929, 1930, coinciding, of course, with the Wall Street crash and then the coming Great Depression. And that's when people begin to reflect and say, well, 10 years on, are we better off? Was that sacrifice worth it? And that's when you start to really, really get the questions about, well, was there a better way to fight the war? Those questions have been asked in the war. They've been asked immediately after the war, but it's in the late 20s and 30s they become strident in public discourse. And the general feeling is this was not the right way to fight the war. We should have been more defensive. We should have made the Germans attack us. And it finds its clearest expression, of course, in France, where a veteran of the First World War himself, André Maginot, he is the mastermind, if you will, the instigator behind France's answer to any future German aggression, which is the construction of the most complex defensive system built in human history to that point. And that's the Maginot Line, which of course is familiar, I'm sure, to most listeners. It's going to run along the Franco-German border and is going to be the ultimate expression of defensive warfare, because to the French mind, the way they conducted the First World War was wrong. Much better to stand on the defensive, make the Germans attack them. And what's lost in that analysis is what we've been discussing, that there are lots and lots of imperatives on the Allies to attack. And in some ways, of course, the tragedy for the French is there's this massive investment in the Maginot Line. And indeed, when the Second World War breaks out, both the British and the French expect a long defensive war against Germany, possibly holding a new Western Front for as long as 3 years, up until 1942-43, at which point the Germans will be exhausted. They'll have been attacking repeatedly, suffering lots of casualties. The British and the French will be at full strength, and only then will they attack. Well, of course, as we know, Dan, those predictions proved completely wrong in 1940.
Yeah, and it's our old friend Combined Arms that's going to be rearing its head once again. That's, of course, another story for another day, and perhaps even another story for another podcast. Whether we're going to stray into the Second World War, who knows? But there's certainly many links that we can draw. But, it's an ongoing question, Spence, and one that I find really interesting. I'm glad that we've kind of got into this big picture today. Not to say that we've got it right, and we'd love to hear what you guys think. If you have a different take, was there a better way to do this? Or was it inevitable that the Great War was going to be fought in the way that we've seen it fought? Now we look back over that 100 years. So please drop us a quick line. Let us know. Thanks once again, as always, for coming along to join us. It's been a great pleasure, and we'll look forward to seeing you again soon. You've been listening to Not So Quiet on the Western Front, a Battle Guide production. If you've enjoyed this podcast, why not check out the Battle Guide YouTube channel, where we regularly release documentaries exploring some of the most famous and extraordinary episodes from throughout military history. If you'd like to support the Battle Guide team to create more content just like this, why not head over to our Patreon, where for the cost of just a cup of coffee, you can get access to full-length virtual battlefield tours, exclusive behind-the-scenes content, decide which subjects we cover in future podcasts and videos, and join a fantastic community of like-minded people. That's all this time. See you again soon.
If you've made it this far, congratulations. You've got all the way to the end of our podcast. And if you stay on a little longer, you'll get our outtakes. But we're really interested to know who actually listens this far into the podcast. So if you're hearing this message, we'd love it if you could just drop a message either to us through our email or on your podcast platform of choice, just saying, I made it, so that we can get a gauge about how many people actually make it this far. And if you're one of those, congratulations.